verses 1 through 10, and then continuing on with chapter 23, verses 1 through 9, and 16 through 17. That begins on page 434. Throughout the month of October, the Old Testament lesson focuses on the book of Job, and we have a few things happening at the end of the month that won't allow us to focus on it then. So we're going to squish Job into a couple of weeks. So this morning we have this week's lesson from Job and next week's lesson from Job, and then next week we will have the final two lessons from Job. So you get the book in a nutshell in these next couple of weeks. The book of Job is a unique one, to say the least. It is classified as wisdom literature in the Old Testament, but really is a book of fiction, quite frankly. It is based on many different sources, one of which is known as the Babylonian theodicy, which means that it is drawn in from many different cultures and many different traditions to create this fictitious story, essentially, with a moral. And so we will begin that story here in the first chapter this morning. There once was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. One day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. He still persists in his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him for no reason." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Skin for skin. All that people have they will give to save their lives. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well, he is in your power. Only spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and inflicted loathsome sores on Job from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Job took a potsherd with which to scrape himself and sat among the ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as any foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. And our story continues on in chapter 23, rather. This is after Job has listened to a number of his friends try and say that he has done something to incur this wrath from God. And this is his response both to them and to God. He says, "Today also my complaint is bitter. His hand is heavy despite my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to this dwelling. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would learn what he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Would he contend with me in the greatness of his power? No, but he would give heed to me. There an upright person could reason with him, and I should be acquitted forever by my judge. If I go forward, he is not there, or backward, I cannot perceive him. On the left he hides, and I cannot behold him. I turn to the right, but I cannot see him. God has made my heart faint. The Almighty has terrified me. If only I could vanish in darkness, and thick darkness would cover my face." May God's blessing be upon the hearing and the understanding of this holy word. As I shared with the kids a moment ago, last Sunday, while you were out making a difference in the community by acting in our service Sunday, I was plodding along the water-soaked streets of Portland running in the Maine Marathon. Finishing in 4 hours and 16 minutes, I was pretty happy with my result, but admittedly my pace fell off after mile 23 as my legs were about done with running and the cold rain started to get to me. It was about that time that I came up behind a guy wearing a bright green shirt with something written on the back. Clearly struggling to cover those last few miles, as pretty much everybody was at that point, I was able to catch up to him and see that his shirt had a big cross on the back along with the name of a church, and then a quote which said something to the effect of, "God's grace makes everything better." As I was pondering this deep theological insight, I had to chuckle as he turned to me and said, "This is the worst. I've never been in so much pain in my entire life." The irony of his statement certainly not lost on me. Now, truth be told, as I turned past mile 24 and came out onto Baxter Boulevard, if you know Portland, where I could see the finish line way down the other end of the back cove, taunting me as if it were on the back of a flatbed truck slowly rolling away, I kind of felt like that guy in the gray shirt. Awful, painful, even hellish would be a good way to describe how those final couple of miles felt. Yet the reality is that running a race is about as far from hell as one can get. Although we distance runners tend to be a little bit masochistic in putting ourselves through so much to finish races, the reality is that we toe the line and we run 26.2 miles by our own choice. The end may not be pleasant, but the fact of the matter is we enjoy the competition and pushing our bodies to the limit. And while we may like to say that it's hell, the reality is that many of us have lived through before and are living through now things that are much more hellish than a tired pair of legs. For just looking around this congregation and listening to our prayers here this morning, I know that all of us have been through some pretty unbearable times in our lives. The unexpected loss of a life partner just a couple of weeks after terminal diagnosis was offered out of the blue. Caring for and eventually saying goodbye to a parent suffering so severely from dementia that they no longer know their family. The unfaithfulness of a spouse that ended a relationship and continues to fracture families. The speechless feeling after the word cancer was uttered on a routine doctor's visit. Sitting back and watching our children make self-destructive choices when we can clearly see a better path. Waking up each day mired in depression, uncertain where our lives might be headed. Excitedly celebrating a new pregnancy, only to learn a couple days later that it has ended in miscarriage. You get the point, I'm sure. I think that all of us can point to something in our lives that we can say was like walking through hell on earth. And it's because of that that Job's story has a deep resonance with each and every one of our lives. Now let me say again, because I cannot say it enough, that the book of Job is fiction. It is not real and it is not intended to be real. As one author writes, the story of a man named Job, a work of fiction, is a work of fiction, and that statement can shock some people. However, the evidence is pretty strong even from the wording of the very first verse. To begin an English language story with once upon a time indicates to the listener or reader that the story is a fairy tale, an account that might have a basis in fact but is made up. Yet such tales tell important truths, and so it is with the story of Job. To get to those important truths, however, we have to wade through a pretty fantastic story. Job, we learn, is blameless and upright, one who fears God and refuses to do evil. In this way, Job is intended to stand for every man or every woman who tries to live their lives in faithfulness to God. We then learn that God and Satan are sitting around one day, perhaps sharing a latte or an adult beverage, when Job comes up in conversation. God is boasting about Job's faithfulness, to which Satan says, well, of course he's faithful because he's living such a blessed life. Let me show him some misfortune, and I bet you he will change his tune. Surprisingly, God agrees to this idea so long as Satan doesn't hurt Job himself. Now, before we go any further with this story, a word needs to be said about Satan. When I say the word Satan, you think of a red-faced, horned-head, demon-like being who is the personification of evil, right? Well, that may be our image today, but that's not what the Old Testament had in mind for Satan. In fact, such a personification doesn't emerge until the time in between the composition of the Old and the New Testament, so way after the book of Job was written. For in the Old Testament, the word that we translate as Satan actually meant the adversary or the accuser. He wasn't the devil. Rather, Satan had come to designate a particular divine being within the heavenly court, one whose specialized function was to seek out and accuse persons of being disloyal to God. So in this cosmological view, then, Satan was kind of a colleague of God's, and a good enough one to get God to agree to a pretty sadistic experiment. For in the section that we skipped over today, we learn that Satan has killed all of Job's oxen and donkeys, his sheep and his servants, and his sons and his daughters. And yet, despite such calamity, Job remains faithful, refusing to curse God. See, God replies to Satan, I told you he'd remain faithful. Well, let me hurt him then, Satan replies, and then we'll see how faithful he really is. To this, God also surprisingly agrees. So Satan afflicts Job with painful sores from his head to his feet, And Job's response is to go and sit among the ashes, scraping his sores with a broken piece of pottery, still unwilling to curse God. It's then that Job's wife tells Job to curse God and die. Now it's here I think we need to focus some time this morning. For Job's wife's suggestion is a good one, is it not? Why don't you curse God for being unjust, she says. There is no one more faithful than you, and look what has happened to you. She's articulating that why do bad things happen to good people question that we struggle with. It's why is there suffering in this world? It's why do the faithful have all this misfortune befall us? Well, as this book shows us, I think, divine justice does not work on cause and effect. In allowing the upright and blameless Job to be put through such hell, we are reminded that bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people all the time. Suffering is not doled out by God on an as-needed basis or an as-deserved basis. In fact, suffering isn't doled out by God at all. And that's a good thing. I think we would all agree, since none of us are perfect, and as such, we'd all be candidates for a healthy dose of suffering. But then the question emerges, is the other picture we get of God any better? No, I don't mean the picture of God in cahoots with Satan, toying with people as this book fictitiously describes, but rather a God who sits back and allows misfortune to befall everyone, regardless of how good, faithful, or faithless we are. Is that a flattering picture of God? And more than that, if that's how God works, should we even have faith in such a God? Should we bother coming to church? Shouldn't we just listen to Job's wife, curse God, and be done with it, since there's nothing to be gained from our faithfulness? My friends, these are hard but important questions to ask ourselves. And for me, the answer to them comes from a line that I share in nearly all of the homilies that I offer to couples who are getting married. I say something to the effect of, God doesn't promise to shelter us from life's storms, but God does promise to be a shoulder to cry on when they hit. In other words, as our other scriptures and our life experiences show us, God never promises us that we will be rewarded for our faithfulness by a life free from tragedy and heartache. But God does promise us that we will never be abandoned when those moments hit. Which is to say that God's not in the business of playing favorites. God's not about showing partiality. God doesn't reward the faithful and punish the faithless. Regardless of what table we commune around on this World Communion Sunday, what our worship service looks like, how we invoke God's name, or even if we invoke God's name, God's promise to us is that all of us will be loved and that none of us will be abandoned. Which makes faith not about securing a reward from God. Rather, it's about saying, thank you. Now wait a minute, you might be saying to yourselves, doesn't Job complain in the second part of today's lesson that God is absent from him? Doesn't he say that he can't find God anywhere in his suffering? He does. In fact, that's exactly what he says. But in so saying, I'm reminded of the words of the author C.S. Lewis, who said, "You can't see anything properly while your eyes are blurred with tears." To me, that's exactly what's happening with Job. As he is mourning the loss of his possessions and his family and his less than helpful friends, his tear-filled eyes can't see that God is right there beside him. But someday he will see. Someday he'll be able to think back on the time of his pain and suffering and see that God was there. It doesn't mean that he has to like what happened to him. We'll talk more about that next week. But he'll know that he wasn't alone in this. And isn't that true for all of us? How many of us can say when we look back on those tough or hellish times in our lives that we don't know how we made it through, or even that somehow those experiences made us stronger or better people? It's true, isn't it? For so often those hard moments in our lives are some of the most transformative that we go through. Unless we think that that transformation is all about our efforts alone, I would argue that it was God working and moving in our midst, unwilling to abandon us, and helping to birth new life and new hope and new possibilities from even the toughest of times. And that, my friends, is enough for me to have faith. That's reason for me to come here and give thanks. That's reason to worship God. because I think we would be remiss in not saying thank you to a God who promises us that we don't have to face all that life throws at us alone. Amen. Our communion hymn is 332 in your